In this video, I will develop some points about the beginning of the third part of the lesson Cultural Upheavals in Europe in the early modern times. So, part 3 is about the question of religious reformations in Europe. And in the meantime, it will be the corrected version of the case study about Martin Luther. So, the Renaissance, the beginning of the early modern times, we saw that in the previous chapters, a moment of very important changes at the cultural level. We saw that in art, and we saw that with the humanist philosophy and invention of printing as well. Well, all these dimensions of what culture is are connected, and religion is certainly part of it. It is part of the culture of the people around the world, and it was strongly part of the culture of the European people during the 16th, 15th and 16th century, because people were still overwhelmingly Christians and really faithful Christians in Europe at that moment. Even the humanists who could criticize some aspects of the way the Catholic Church used to work, they remained strong believers in God and Jesus. So there was a real demand for a good religion, in a way, in Europe, and from all levels of society, from the elite as well as from the common people. And people were often disappointed with the quality of the religious practice that was proposed by the Catholic Church at that moment. And one man was more instrumental than others in changing things and shaking up the Christian religion in Western Europe, and that man was the German monk Martin Luther. So, as seen in the case study, Martin Luther was an intellectual. He studied and then became a doctor at the University of Wittenberg in Germany in theology. Theology means the study of God and religion, basically. And he was also himself a monk. Okay, he belonged to the clergy of the Catholic Church in Germany. But he was totally appalled by some aspects of the functioning of the Catholic Church of his century, and in particular, he was appalled by the relation that the Church had with money. Well, one remark about that is that during the Middle Ages, there had already been some religious groups, but often within the Catholic Church, who criticized the wealth and also the greed of the Catholic clergy, and they created some religious orders like the Franciscan Brotherhood, for example, who rejected the idea of wealth in the Church. So that was already an old question, actually. But in the 16th century, there was a new practice that had been developed by the clergy and by the Pope himself, which was called indulgences. And indulgences was a practice which consisted in selling some acts of forgiveness. So faithful Christians could be partly redeemed, which means forgiven for their sins, in exchange of sums of money. And for Martin Luther, this was something absolutely horrible and totally contrary to the Christianity that he believed in and that he wanted to promote. So just one note about his personal history. What particularly disgusted him was the huge amount of wealth that was put in Rome by the Catholic Church, and in particular during the building of St. Peter's Basilica, so the cathedral of the Pope, which is indeed, we talked about that in the previous lesson, an absolutely exceptional building, really a celebration of the power and the wealth of the Pope and all the Catholic Church. And I did visit this basilica quite recently, 1 year ago, when I went to Rome, and indeed it's incredibly impressive. It's really a display of power. And if you take, for example, this statue, which is one of the numerous statues you can see inside the church, you try to realize that the little angel that you can see at the bottom of the picture, he is as big, as tall as an adult, as a human adult. So it's a statue, it's a sculpture of more than 5 meters high. So everything is big as this in St. Peter's Basilica. So Luther was appalled by this. And so he came along with some revolutionary ideas. In the case study, some excerpts from Luther's and some of his followers' writings are proposed. And in this one, the first document, there is one sentence in particular that had to be quoted and explained in your case study. And it's this one. There is among the Christians no difference at all but that of office. We are all one body. What Luther was criticizing was the difference that was made between the clergy, called spiritual estate, and the Christians that were only simple faithful, simple believers. We could call them the lay people. That distinction, that separation, was essential in the conception of the Catholic Church. Everybody was Christian in the Catholic Church, but the clergy was in a way more Christian than the others. Luther totally rejected that. That's revolutionary because it meant, if you develop the idea, that for Luther there was no need for a clergy. Only some people that could take office and act, for example, in organizing ceremonies, but that was all. No specific status. And this is how Protestant churches work. The other quote, which is very important here, is the ending. Baptism, gospel, and faith alone make us spiritual and a Christian people. So Luther was really redefining what Christianity meant for him. And he believed baptism, which is a sacrament, had to be kept. But he believed that faith alone and the teachings of the gospel, for him it means the Bible, and the Bible only, they should be the basis of what Christianity is. What you must understand is that for him, only the writings of the Bible were relevant. All the other Christian books, all the beliefs that had been introduced after the Bible by the Catholic Church, they meant nothing. And it included a lot of beliefs, like, for example, the belief in the sacred aspect of Virgin Mary, praying Virgin Mary, something ridiculous for Luther. That's just one of the numerous examples. In the other text, which is not written exactly by Luther but by one of his followers, there are also some important quotes. Here it is said that men cannot be justified before God by their own strength, merit, or works, but are freely justified for Christ's sake through faith. That is extremely important, and that is the second very important revolutionary idea of Luther. Doing penance for the Catholic Church is, when you give money to the poor, for example, or when you go on a pilgrimage, when you do those actions that for the Catholics are necessary to be a good Christian, and so to be saved and go to heaven in the afterlife. For Luther, nothing of this was pertinent. There is only one way to be saved and go to heaven for Luther, and that is faith, which means believing, and that's all. That's another revolutionary idea. Next excerpt also from the Augsburg Confession, which is a kind of summary of Lutheran belief. It is said, they teach that those ought to be observed as particular holidays, festivals, and the like. Here the they refers to the priest of the Catholic Church. They say that you must celebrate some holidays. For Luther, no importance to that, no importance, faith only. And he adds, consciences are not to be burdened as though such observance was necessary to salvation. It is not necessary to salvation to celebrate Easter or Christmas, for example. You can do it as an homage paid to God, but it's not necessary. Only faith is necessary according to Luther. And lastly, vows and traditions concerning meats and days, etc., instituted to merit grace and to make satisfaction for sins are useless and contrary to the gospel. So for him, even the notion of a Sunday dedicated to God, no importance. Any tradition regarding meat, which means in the Catholic Church no meat on Friday, useless for him. And when he talks about vows, he's talking about marriage. You don't need to be married to go to heaven. And also the vow which was taken by monks. Okay, for him, useless. There are no Protestant monks, no Protestant abbeys. It does not exist. You understand that when I say Protestant, I mean Lutheran, because it's in a way the other name given to Lutheran churches. And a consequence of all this, because only the Bible is important and because you don't need to listen to a clergy, for Luther it was essential to translate the Bible in common language. That's absolutely essential, which also leads us to another question in the case study. The printing press, the fact that books could be easily copied and distributed, was an essential aspect of Luther's success. Now, the impact on his personal life. Well, the big impact on his personal life is that he was excommunicated, which means he was expelled from the Catholic Church by the Pope. For the Pope, he was not a Christian anymore. But in a way, he was free, and that is why he got married and was able to build his own church. That was kind of violent, but Luther was also symbolically violent. When he received a letter from the Pope telling him that he was excommunicated, he simply burnt it. This is what is illustrated on this picture. Okay, and now to finish, let's have a look at this very, very interesting and detailed painting by Lucas Cranach, who was a Protestant and a German painter as well. So it shows on the left the Lutheran Church and on the right the Catholic Church. So if we zoom on some details about the Catholic Church, everything is critical. It's only criticizing and even caricaturing the Catholic Church. So for example, here you can clearly see the Pope taking indulgences and selling indulgences. You can also see a monk who is obviously has taken some poultry from people, because the church used to raise taxes. You can see a monk who likes to play cards, and some playing cards are falling from his dress. And if we look at the top of the picture, you can see that God is very angry. Looking at what the Catholic Church has become, and I think the cartoon is funny here. You can see that a monk is speaking, but he's inspired by a little demon, and you can see that the church is only consisting of the clergy. There is no common people here. It's only the clergy speaking to the clergy. So this is really problematic. And in the background, you can see a pilgrimage, totally useless for Luther, and also sacraments given to a dead body, useless as well. I only have a couple of seconds to talk about the Protestant Church. So on the other side, everything is perfect. Luther here, as a preacher, is directly connected to God because he's reading the Bible. Okay, baptism still exists, and at the bottom we can see that another sacrament of the Catholic Church has been kept by the Protestants. It's called the Eucharist, is the sharing of bread and wine during the Mass. And that's it.